Way back in the olden times of technology, when something new came out, it was a big deal. Usually the release of any major new consumer tech revolved around new features of the next generation. When the iPhone came out, that was a big deal. No one had ever seen anything quite like that, and for a few subsequent releases, more and more impressive features were added on that justified the consumer coughing up the outrageous amount of money to purchase it. This was also a very, very key point with the release of new consoles. If we go way back to the very beginning of console gaming, we find the OG, the Magnavox Odyssey, which at the time was super cool. You were able to play video games at home, no longer needing to go to the dang old arcade. Now, of course, by modern standards, this console is very lackluster, with all of its games being able to be played on the side of a touchscreen vape if you really wanted to. But this was just the beginning. Even today, new generations of consoles are released to the masses, but nowadays they aren't really anything too crazy. Better graphics and more memory. Yeah, that's not worth $600. Hate to break it to you, Microsoft, but adding fucking Windows to my Xbox is not something I want! But for quite a long time, upgrading graphics and memory and computer power was the selling point for two of the three major console producers. I am, of course, referring to PlayStation and Xbox. Updating the hardware and capabilities of their consoles were very important. They were at war with each other over who could make the better piece of machinery. Though eventually, if you asked me, the war ended because, well, how much better do the graphics really need to be, right? They basically reached a standstill in innovation, but there was a point where both Xbox and PlayStation deviated from their usual philosophy of, oh no, just make the machine better, around 2010. And they both released their own versions of motion control games. That's weird, isn't it? Well, most consumers at the time thought so too, but it was pretty obvious why they did it. Remember, Xbox and PlayStation were two of the three major console providers, and that pesky little third manufacturer had released a console in 2006 that was so damn out of the box when it came to innovation that really no one could have guessed the success it would have. I am, of course, referring to Nintendo and the Wii. The thing that used to be so great about Nintendo was their approach to console designs, and it's not a hot take to say that Nintendo has pioneered a lot when it comes to gaming. While other consoles focus largely on their console's performances and online abilities, Nintendo decided to reinvent what was possible within the confines of at-home gaming systems. While the Wii did have online abilities, just like the PlayStation and Xbox, they were far more limited and not the focus of the console themselves. Instead, Nintendo directed its focus largely to single-player and party-based games. Now, many would point to the Wii as the first major use of motion control technology, and they would be wrong, sort of. It was the first and kind of only major successful console to use at-home motion-based controls, but they were not the first to come up with the concept. One of the first versions of motion controls dates back to the 1980s with Sega's Heavyweight Champ arcade series. The game had its players use a physical punching mechanism attached to the machine in an attempt to emulate real boxing. And to be honest, there were a lot of these types of games with strange controllers that can all be classified as early versions of motion control games. I'm talking arcade games that had people leaning side to side to emulate skiing, like the game Sega Ski. Early arcade laser gun games, such as Time Crisis or House of the Dead, implemented an early form of motion control with their physical gun controllers, which utilized a system called CRT Flash. CRT Flash was when the screen would flash white for a moment when the trigger was pulled and a photodiode inside the gun detected where it was aimed based on timing. These were sort of a predecessor to more advanced forms of motion controls that we would eventually see. In fact, this genre of light gun arcade games would be the first place the technology used in modern motion control would be implemented. That being the infrared laser sensor, or IR lasers for short. So, what are IR lasers? The way motion control works is by emitting these invisible IR lasers from LED lights and using a sensor or camera to detect that light's position and movement. When the controller moves, the pattern of IR points it sees changes, and the system uses that shift to figure out where the controller is pointing and how it's moving. So with multiple IR points, it can triangulate very precise 3D positions, and with its lasers, it can measure the distance or angles where the player and controller controller is. One of the very first games to implement this was an extremely unique arcade IR gun shooter called Police 911 in the American release, but better known as Police 24/7 by Konami. This game took a massive leap forward with motion controls, no longer limiting the motion control aspect to just a gun, but rather the player's entire body. In prior arcade shooters, there would be this pedal operated by the player's foot to dodge or go in and out of cover. For example, games like Time Crisis 3 implemented the pedal action cover system for players to avoid being hit and to reload. Police 24/7 used a similar system gameplay-wise, but completely removed the pedal, instead replacing it with a grid of IR lasers that detected the player's movements. So in order to dodge incoming projectiles or get behind cover, the player had to physically lean or crouch. It was the first time that your movement without pressing any buttons or pedals directly controlled an on-screen character. On the note of arcade games, we also have to mention dance games. I'm sure one comes to mind. Yes, DDR, Dance Dance Revolution. Now, DDR wasn't really a motion control game in the sense that we're talking about. Yes, obviously there was a lot of motion used in playing the game, but the controls were not motion controls in the sense that the Wii or the Kinect were. Instead, it required the players to hit pressure-sensitive floor pads in sync with the song in order to score points. Now, why is this important, you ask? Well, dance games are definitely one of the more applicable genres when it comes to using motion controls, and game developers were fully aware of this. So in 2000, the arcade game Para Para Paradise would be released in Japan. Para Para Paradise was a dancing game similar vein to DDR, but with no pressure plates. Instead, the game had a top-down IR sensor and camera control system that tracked the player's physical movements as the controls. So, entering the 2000s, the IR laser and camera technology had established itself in Japan and partially in the United States with these large arcade games. They were definitely popular for the novelty of them, but most people really didn't have the money or desire to outright purchase these machines, and the machines themselves were very, very pricey. Other arcade games ran around $2,000 to $3,000 on average, but games like Police 24/7 and Para Para Paradise ran upwards of $7,000 to $10,000 due to the complexity of the technology inside of them. Even more basic forms of motion control games that use tilt boards or punch detection still ran as much as $5,000. So the average arcade wasn't really filling the rows with these machines either. Even in Japan, these were still more of a novelty instead of the norm despite their popularity. But that popularity would inspire some important people in the coming years. Again, enter the mid-2000s now. The PlayStation 2 has become the best-selling at-home console of all time. Microsoft has launched their flagship console, the Xbox, as competition, and both of these consoles pushed the hardware limits for at-home game systems at the time. At the same time, Nintendo had released their own little console, the GameCube. Though a fan favorite today, the GameCube underperformed both in hardware capabilities and financially in comparison to the PS2 and Xbox. Now, this financial failure was quite the wake-up call for Nintendo. Their new CEO, Satoru Iwata, realized change was required if Nintendo was to compete, but not changing their hardware. Iwata realized a hardware competition was futile, stating, "If we keep trying to make a more powerful box than Sony and Microsoft, we will lose every time." That's so dramatic. So Nintendo went to a different direction, shifting their focus from console power to console creativity. Understanding that their next major console release had to be successful, they shifted their philosophy away from the hardware arms race to the idea of disruption and no longer competition. And this philosophy extended beyond just hardware. Nintendo realized there was a massive untapped market when it came to gaming. The Xbox, PS2, and PC gaming all catered to more hardcore audiences as they saw it, and trying to cater to that hardcore audience would be pointless. Instead, they looked at literally every other demographic. Non-gamers, older adults, women, families, washed old gamers, really you name it. But the question now was, how do you get them to play video games, and what was stopping them from playing in the first place? Well, they came to an answer pretty quickly, and it was a pretty unique one. It wasn't that these people didn't like or want to play games, it was that gaming had become somewhat inaccessible to this demographic. And what was gatekeeping them? It was the controllers. Nintendo again realized that the way modern controllers for at-home consoles functioned may have been an inhibiting factor for their new target demographics. Controller layouts were complicated, with too many buttons, which sort of scared away potential casual gamers. Older arcade games and at-home consoles were pretty simple for most people to pick up, and that widened the potential of demographics that would play them. At this point, Nintendo had a solid plan in place for who they were targeting and how they were going to go about doing it, but the problem they now faced was, what could they make that wasn't just rehashing old arcade games, but still had simple to learn and fun to play controls? Well, their answer was pretty straightforward. Let's get rid of the buttons as much as we can, and let's do motion controls. And hence, one of the most iconic consoles in gaming history was born, the Wii. Nintendo looked at the beloved gimmicky motion control arcade games around Japan, but when they looked at them, they didn't see motion control as a gimmick, rather as a tool to remove the barrier of entry. And that it did. The Wii Remote was a simple one, having just a few buttons, but more importantly, it wasn't shaped like a traditional gaming controller. Instead, it was shaped like a TV remote. And it sort of functioned like one in a way too. Just point the controller at the TV, but now just move it around. That's it. There was no learning curve required. Unlike motion control games of the past, the Wii was relatively inexpensive to produce and use. And the way it functioned on a technical level was also very simple. Every Wii console came with one of these small bars that the user would place on top of or around their TV. These bars contained 10 LED lasers, 5 on each side that pointed in the direction of the user. The Wii Remote had these little black boxes on the front of them which contained an IR camera that picked up the bar's emitted lasers. From this, the Wii could determine where you were pointing at the screen and how far away from the screen you were and whether or not you were tilting or rotating the remote. Over the course of its lifespan, the Wii would have just over 1,600 games released for the console, but funny enough, most of the top-selling games throughout its lifespan were Wii-branded games, like Wii Sports. Everyone loves Wii Sports, and it made sense, too. If you knew the basic movements of the emulated sport, you could play it. Know how to play baseball? Just swing the bat, right? Just swing the remote. There you go, you're playing. No barrier of entry, easy to learn controls, fun gameplay. Well, Nintendo's design philosophy worked pretty damn well. The Wii sold for a price of $250 USD on release, which was generally cheaper than most at-home consoles, and it was bundled with Wii Sports, which had like a million different games inside of it, so overall it netted over $100 million in sales, which is the 7th most successful console release of all time. Throughout its lifespan, the Wii would also include other features from old arcade motion control games, like a tilt board and the Wii Gun. Nintendo had really hit it out of the park with motion controls. The untapped demographic in the gaming market had become accessible, and motion controls were cheaper to produce and didn't require advanced hardware. It was a cash cow, and their competition was noticing. Xbox started developing their own version of motion capture, but decided to go a different route. They wanted to use depth cameras. Unlike the Wii, with the IR lasers, depth cameras didn't require the player to be holding a controller to play the games. Much like Paradise, their body was the controller. But the problem was that this tech was pretty iffy. They quickly found a way to do it. They acquired a startup called PrimeSense that had been working on the tech for a while, and in 2010 they released this new motion control Xbox system under the name the Kinect. PlayStation also got in on the action, launching their own control system called Move in 2010. Move functioned sort of like a Wii, featuring a remote, but theirs had this weird-looking orb on the front of it. The PlayStation had this camera edition that was built into it, and the camera would track the orb using a mix of sensors and color tracking and Bluetooth. In fact, this was actually the best form of at-home motion tracking technology, and it was so accurate it could track movement with accuracy down to millimeters. But there was a massive difference aside from their tracking tech between these competitors and the Wii. Whereas the Wii sold as this individual console, the Kinect and Move were additional features that were added onto your existing console. In the long term, the Kinect and the Move were flops, but in the short term, they weren't. Motion control games had become a super popular, beloved gimmick for casual gamers since the Wii's success, and these additions were cheaper than outright buying a new console for those who wanted in on motion control games, but only had an Xbox or a PlayStation. So if in the first 18 months of their respective launches, they did pretty good, but that success fell off a cliff. One of the main reasons was game availability. They didn't have good titles, with their most successful games on both platforms essentially just being knockoffs of Wii Sports, but also dance games. The Xbox Kinect had a game called Dance Central. Now, Dance Central is an inherently silly game that I'd like to have a side note on. I have a very distinct memory of being in middle school PE, and it was raining outside, and our gym teacher had no idea what to do with us, so she brought us into the gym, pulled down a massive projector, and just played YouTube recordings of Dance Central compilations, and we all had to dance to the projector. That's my experience with the game, and it wasn't fun. And it seemed like a lot of other people didn't think it was worth the price tag if the best game available was fucking Dance Central. The other side of the game problem was that developers just didn't really want to make them for the Kinect or for the Move. The Kinect's 3D camera tracking system was, to be blunt, it was shitty. If you had bad lighting, you basically couldn't use it. And implementing games beyond sports and dance emulators was hard to do, so developers just kind of didn't make games, hence making the library very limited in comparison to the Wii. The Move experienced a similar problem, but just not due to the hardware. Like I said, the Move worked great, but Sony just didn't capitalize on it. It didn't have any flagship games or just anything. The Move was just sort of there. And to top it all off, around 2012, the motion control game craze started to fall off. Basically, the shiny new toy wasn't shiny anymore. People started realizing the gameplay was limited, and it wasn't going to be changing anytime soon, so the industry just returned to normal, so to say. Now, motion control itself isn't a huge genre anymore, but its technology is still used pretty frequently. The tech has branched beyond just gaming and is utilized quite heavily in VR now, but beyond that, it's not something you see too often in video games. I grew up with a Wii and always had fond memories playing it, and when I go to local arcade bars, I like to play their old motion control games too. But ultimately, motion control has returned to its natural form, and that is being a gimmick. Did you ever have one of these motion control game consoles? Were you ever forced to play Dance Central in middle school? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're still here, consider liking and subscribing. Looking for a present? Buy a sticker! I make 60 cents per purchase. Thanks, Etsy! Well, this is probably my last video of the year, so happy holidays. I'll see you guys next year. And I'd like to thank everyone, all the loyal subscribers for the support throughout this past year. I started out with 300 subscribers in January, and I'm almost at 8K, which is pretty wild stuff because I'd never even think that I would ever get to 1,000 with the quality of content I produce. So thank you all for watching. At 10K, I plan on doing a public access style call-in live stream. So if you would like to watch me and bother me while I wear a ski mask answering phone calls in a closet, subscribe and get me to 10K. Make fake accounts, subscribe to me. Tell your grandma to subscribe to me. That's it. I love you. Bye-bye.